the roadway. So there's a certain set of projects that are eligible. Then in addition, within that set of highway funding eligible projects, they must pick projects that, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase adaptation. I'm not sure how the roadways are going to sequester carbon, although perhaps in terms of plantings and the medians and along the sideways.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I just had a question about ports in general. Will this legislation be promoting the most efficient forms of transportation also, and would a port that is helping to take some of the trucks off the road and be a better facilitate some of this carbon savings, would we be able to participate in that program?
I think the answer is possibly. The goal, the OTC will administer the funding in the highway account to, again, make sure that it's that those dollars are helping to achieve the programmatic goals related to climate. The Climate Investment Fund dollars, those are less restricted in the sense that they don't have to be spent in the roadway. It could be potentially spent in other geographic areas, other landscapes, other sectors beyond transportation. But again, still must have that the requirement of achieving the programmatic goals around climate. Whether projects that a port were to propose, fit that lens, would be evaluated by the legislature in the future as they make decisions over, how they want to prioritize those dollars.
Next, even though she's virtual, you can't see her, but Megan has joined us. So
Hi, Megan.
If you want to introduce yourself, we have a microphone into the speaker, so we should be able to hear you, and you can ask your question.
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Megan Fleer. I'm your tribal postal representative, former staff of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Run, and tribal member there as well. I apologize, I can't be there in person, and I had to miss a little bit of this morning, and I had to step out early for the classes, as I'm currently at Oregon State, so not too far from you guys. And thank you for coming to explain, some of this, 2020, right? I just had a quick question, because I know some of the concerns from the tribes in the past with this bill have been that tribes were not specifically called out in terms of the disproportionately affected communities that could receive some of the funds. So I was wondering if you could just quickly speak to if maybe some of that language has been changed in this new proposal of this bill, and if there's any tribal membership on, say, like the Joint Committee or other committees that can decide where some of those funding where some of that funding is going to.
Sure, be happy to. So the Dash 31 amendments clarifies the following. One, that 10% of the proceeds in the Climate Investment Fund go to projects and activities that directly benefit the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon, and those 9 federally recognized tribes are now named in the Dash 31 amendments. And that's 10% of the Climate Investment Fund dedicated to projects and activities that benefit those tribes. So that has been addressed in the Dash 31s. In terms of tribal representation, the Joint Committee on Climate Action, that's a legislative committee, so that's House and Senate representation only. However, there are 2 other bodies envisioned explicitly in the statute. One is a board that would advise the director of what House Bill 2020 says is the Carbon Policy Office, and that board we envision would include at least one tribal representative amongst other members. There's also in the preparation of that investment report, that report that outlines the different investment opportunities that would be available to the state. There is right now there's currently direction that board should that citizens committee to advise on that investment report should reflect the geographic and social, economic, cultural diversity of the state, but expressly calls out membership by tribes on that committee. That may be an area where there's additional specification brought in the weeks of legislative discussion ahead. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, that does. Thank you so much for the clarification.
Thank you, Megan. Charlie, you're next.
I'm just trying to better understand how the coast and the ocean fits into this or doesn't fit into this. And so John brought up the issue of marine fuels, and you said that they're excluded. Is that right? I'd kind of like to know why and whether or not that changes opportunities for investments in coastal programs and ocean work, and also whether or not that affects like opportunities for ports who may have projects as well that could be benefiting from reducing carbon emissions and otherwise. Certainly the actions of a port can have big implications on transportation and carbon emissions. So I'm kind of curious, in excluding that, does that change the ability to make those investments in the coast for types of projects and ocean projects and research and otherwise?
No, it should not. I think the rationale for excluding marine fuels and the sellers of marine fuels from having to acquire an emissions allowance under the program was based on the recognition that at this point, particularly for our fishing fleets along the coast, there are no alternatives to marine diesel fuel for operating those vessels. And so there was concern about what the cost impact would be to fishing fleets in the absence of technologies, other kinds of efficiencies that could, mitigate that effect on that particular group of users. So that's the rationale for why marine fuels are exempt from regulation. It's obviously a very small portion of the total amount of fuels that are sold in the state of Oregon. And not sort of the primary source of our greenhouse gas emissions. That's the vehicles that operate on our roads and highways. But with that said, that does not exclude projects in coastal zones from being the beneficiaries of any of the climate investment proceeds that are available from the program. So,
A follow-up question. I think politically, that's a concern. I understand the interest of the fishing community. I think there's a lot of other vessels that move in and out of our ports. And I can, immediately what comes to mind are cruise ships. And there's a lot of innovation in cruise ships, technology and fuel consumption and use. So I'm curious, by excluding the fishing community as a hardship, and I totally understand that, did we make the blanket decision to exclude all industry from marine transportation?
It excludes any of the fuels, marine fuels sold here in the state of Oregon. So to the extent that captures users who go beyond obviously our fishing fleets, then I think the answer is yes. And I believe the -31 amendments also asked the legislature to review that decision. I think it's in 5 years, but I would have to double check on the date to sort of see, where the status of technology, as well as how other jurisdictions are including marine fuels in their programs, as well as aviation fuels at that point, to see whether that's a decision that should be revisited at some future date.
And one more question, if I may.
We have until 10:45, but I was told that Kristen needed to leave promptly, and so I'm trying to respect her time. So if you have until 10:45, we can keep going. It's really up to you.
I'm okay for a few more minutes, thank you.
This is a quick one. In the transportation, you mentioned, was it 50? What was there was some number for the space where that investment can happen. 50% can happen within so much of the roadway, the highways. What is
So
that?
in the transportation dollars, so these are proceeds from the sale of allowances to entities that sell gasoline, primarily gasoline and diesel on road fuels. those are restricted to the Highway Trust Fund, and the constitutional restrictions in Oregon on that trust fund are that the dollars must be spent in ways that on projects within the highway right of way. And our Department of Transportation, knows the ins and outs of sort of what kinds of projects are eligible or ineligible, according to that constitutional restriction. Then within that Highway Trust Fund, what House Bill 2020 says is that at least 50% of those dollars can be spent on, projects that the state, operates and initiates, so statewide transportation projects, versus 50% should be prioritized for projects, transportation projects that originate at the local or county level. So those are your, projects that are more likely to be, on your local and county roads as compared to the state highway system.
So for the coast, I think my question may be a clarification from Parks about whether or not the beaches remain in that right of way and would be opportune for an investment.
I don't believe they are, but that would be a better question for ODOT to answer for certain. But I've never heard that referenced as a potential use of those
Well,
highway trust fund
I
dollars.
wouldn't expect that would happen in Salem, but thanks.
Okay, John?
I have one couple more questions. Is there a policy firewall between these two accounts, in the general fund? Will any of this money go to the general fund?
No, none of the proceeds from the sale of allowances in this program are not allowable in the general fund. They must be spent. These are fees on pollution allowances, on emission allowances, and they are required to be spent on activities that help achieve the goals of the program. So they're not allowable in the general fund, which is why they go into these two separate accounts with requirements on how these accounts are expended.
Okay, the other point I'd like to make is that the fishing industry is connected with these other non-exempt industries, not to a major degree, but it would affect the cost of commercial fishing in Oregon, even if the vessels themselves were exempt. And that supplies and trucking and anything that's brought from a non-exempt entity needed for fishing. I just wanted to say that.
Is that a question or a statement? Next on the list is Walter.
You mentioned this, the state is going to be auctioning these off to the highest bidder. We have state agencies such as ODFW, Forestry, and Parks that are going to be part of, sequestering carbon. How will they see a benefit to that? Will they have access to these funds as a priority? All these agencies are always seeking funding, and I was hoping that they would be able to have access to some of these funds as a priority, since they are part of the sequestration process.
Sure. I think the expectation on the part of the legislature is that to the extent that that we have existing programs in state government that achieve, the sequestration, adaptation, and emissions mitigation goals of the program, that those programs could apply for funding, and be considered alongside other projects and activities that are eligible for dollars in the Climate Investments Fund.
I'll just ask one last question. So, early on there was a lot of discussion about not only the role of the oceans in terms of, needing to be buffered in OA and OAH issues, but also the potential to maybe sequester carbon in the ocean through kelp or other opportunities. Is that still a discussion point within there, or is it, just an eligible use as a potential project?
I believe it's an eligible use as a type of project, and I know one that some legislators have a fair amount of excitement and optimism for.
Any other questions? Well, it was a real honor to have you here today. I appreciate it. I know you're incredibly busy, and I really grateful you took the time out of your schedule to come over and brief us on this important issue.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for your thoughtful questions.